still. Unless you prefer they find you.
The night Elspeth Cavanmore fled the Duke of Ravenscroft's estate, she did not run toward freedom. She ran toward something far worse. Her slippers were gone by the second mile, the cold earth cutting into her feet as she pushed through the dark tree line bordering the estate's western edge. Behind her, torchlight flickered between the oaks. They were already searching. The Duke's men moved fast for men who had been drinking, and Elspeth had counted on them being slower. She had counted wrong. When the stranger's hand closed around her arm in the darkness, she nearly screamed, but his voice came low and urgent against her ear before the sound could escape her throat.
Be still.
Unless you prefer
they find you.
She stilled, not because she trusted him. She could feel the steel of a pistol against her ribs, cold through the thin fabric of her gown, and she understood immediately that she had not escaped danger tonight. She had only traded one cage for another, and this one had no walls she could yet see, which made it infinitely more terrifying. The torch beams swept wide across the tree line. She held her breath. The stranger held her tighter. Who was this man? Why had he been waiting in those woods at that precise hour? And why, when the torches finally turned back toward the estate, did he whisper her name, her full name, as though he had known all along that she would come? If you want to find out what this stranger knows, and what it will cost Elspeth to survive him, subscribe right now. This story is only just beginning. The stranger did not release her arm, even after the torchlight pulled back toward the estate, and the sound of boots on frozen ground faded into silence. His grip remained, not bruising, but absolute, the kind of hold that communicated very clearly that letting go was entirely his decision and not hers. Elspeth stood in the dark of the tree line, breathing in shallow pulls, her bare feet pressed into cold earth, and tried to think. She was good at thinking. It was the one weapon no one had ever managed to strip from her. Her name was Elspeth Cavanmore, and 3 hours ago she had been seated at the Duke of Ravenscroft's dinner table, pouring wine into a glass. She had no intention of drinking. She had spent 4 months in that estate. 4 months learning its corridors, its rhythms, its silences. 4 months watching the Duke smile at her the way a collector smiles at something he has already decided to own. She had not run in panic tonight. She had run because the window she had been waiting for had finally opened, and windows in places like Ravenscroft did not stay open long. What she had not planned for was the man standing beside her now. He stepped away from her at last, moving to the edge of the tree line to look back toward the estate. The moonlight caught the line of his jaw, the breadth of his shoulders beneath a coat that was too plain for a gentleman and too well cut for anyone else. He was tall, unhurried in his movements, which was the thing that unsettled her most, because men who moved without urgency in situations like this were either very foolish or very dangerous, and nothing about him suggested foolishness, she said quietly, because quiet was the only register available to her right now. You know my name. He did not turn around. I know a great deal more than your name, Miss Cavanmore. Then you have the advantage of me. Yes, he said simply. I do. She studied the back of him, cataloguing what she could in the dark. No signet ring on the hand that had held her. No livery. The pistol had disappeared back into his coat with the ease of someone accustomed to carrying one, which told her he was not a man who wore a weapon for show. He had been standing in those specific trees at that specific hour, and he had known she would come through that part of the estate's western boundary, which meant he had either been watching her. For how long? She could not yet calculate, or someone had told him. Both possibilities were deeply alarming. Who sent you? She asked. He turned then, and she got her first real look at his face. He was perhaps 30, perhaps a little more, with dark eyes that held the particular quality of someone who had spent considerable time watching people and very little time being watched in. There was a scar along his left temple, thin and old, the kind that had been stitched carefully by someone who knew what they were doing. He was not a soft man. Every line of him said so without apology. That, he said, is the wrong question. What is the right question? How far Ravenscroft's reach actually extends. He glanced back toward the estate once more, then at her feet, bare and darkened with earth, and what she suspected was blood from the sharper stones near the estate's eastern path. Something moved across his expression, brief and controlled, before it was gone. We need to move. Can you walk? I ran 2 miles without shoes. I imagine I can manage walking. The corner of his mouth shifted, not quite a smile, something adjacent to it. Then walk. He moved into the trees and she followed, because the alternative was standing alone in the dark, with Ravenscroft's men at her back. And Elspeth Cavanmore had not survived 4 months in that estate by making sentimental decisions. She had grown up in the colony of New South Wales, the daughter of a man who had gone out to the Antipodes with ambitions and come back to England with debts. Her father, Cornelius Cavanmore, had been charming in the way that men who need things from other people are always charming, and he had possessed an extraordinary talent for arranging his children's lives around his own requirements. Elspeth was the eldest. She had understood her position early. When the Duke of Ravenscroft had expressed interest, her father had presented it to her as fortune. She had understood it as something else entirely. She had gone to the estate because refusing had not been a real option. She had stayed because leaving required preparation, and she had prepared with the quiet, methodical patience of someone who had learned very young that visible resistance only invites tighter chains. The man ahead of her moved through the dark trees with certainty, which meant he knew this land, which meant he had been here before, possibly many times. She filed that away. "You still haven't told me your name," she said to his back. Dashiell War. She turned the name over. It was not one she recognized from the circles Ravenscroft moved in, which was either meaningless or significant. She had not yet decided which. "And what is it you want, Mr. War?" He stopped walking. She nearly stepped into him, caught herself, and found that he had turned to face her again. They were deeper in the trees now, the estate entirely out of sight, and the silence around them was the complete, pressured silence of open country at night. "What I want," he said, "is to get you out of this county before dawn. What happens after that depends on how honest you're willing to be with me about what you took from Ravenscroft's study before you left." The cold moved through her differently then. Not the cold of the night air or the frozen earth beneath her feet. Something interior, something that had nothing to do with temperature. She kept her face still. It was something she had practiced until it required no effort. "I don't know what you mean," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. His expression did not change in any dramatic way, but something in his eyes shifted, the way water shifts when something moves beneath the surface, and she understood with sudden and uncomfortable clarity that he was not a man who would be managed easily. "You will," he said, and turned and walked on. She stood in the dark for 3 full seconds, which was longer than she could afford, before she followed. The document tucked beneath the lining of her cloak pressed against her ribs with every step, a small, relentless weight. She had taken it from Ravenscroft's study 11 days ago, photographed its contents into memory, and hidden it with the careful thoroughness of someone who understood that the object itself was less important than what it proved. What it proved was something that went far beyond one duke's appetite for ownership. She had not yet decided what to do with that knowledge. She had not yet decided if she would survive long enough to do anything at all. Dashiell War walked ahead of her through the trees and said nothing more, and the silence between them was not comfortable, but it was alive. Threaded through with things unsaid on both sides, with the particular tension of 2 people who each know the other is concealing something and have decided for now to keep moving anyway. The question was not whether he knew about the document. the question was who had sent him to retrieve it, and whether getting Elspeth Cavanmore safely out of this counties was the actual objective, or simply the most efficient way to get it back. They walked for close to an hour before Dashiell stopped. The trees had thinned by then, opening onto a narrow road that cut between two dark fields, and at the road's edge stood a horse, tied loosely to a post that looked like it had been placed there deliberately and recently. One horse. Elspeth noted that immediately. One horse for two people, which meant either he had not planned to bring her this far on foot, or he had planned something else entirely, and was now improvising. She was not certain which of those options she preferred. He untied the horse without ceremony and turned to look at her. She was shivering by then, though she had been working hard not to show it. The night had deepened into the kind of cold that stopped being uncomfortable and started being dangerous, and her feet had gone from painful to numb, which she understood was not an improvement. He said nothing. He simply held out his hand. She looked at it. There was a particular kind of moment that Elspeth had learned to recognize over the years, the moment where the available options collapsed down to one, and pride became an indulgence she could not afford. She had stood in that moment many times before, in her father's study when the creditors came, in the Duke's drawing room when she understood what kind of guest she actually was. She recognized it now, in the dark, on an empty road, with no shoes and no allies, and a stolen document pressed against her ribs. She took his hand. He helped her up without comment and mounted behind her, and they moved onto the road at a pace that was fast enough to cover ground, and quiet enough not to carry. His arm came around her to hold the reins, and she sat stiffly within the circle of it, aware of the warmth of him at her, back in a way she found both relieving and deeply inconvenient. She had not been this close to another person, not by choice in a very long time. Elspeth had been 12 years old the first time she understood that her father's love for her was primarily administrative. He had sat her down in the small parlour of their rented house in Sydney and explained, with the patient reasonableness of a man who had already made his decision, that as the eldest she would need to be sensible. That sensible, in his vocabulary, meant useful. That useful meant marriageable. That marriageable, given their circumstances, meant she would need to make herself agreeable to men who had resources her father required. He had not said it that plainly. He never said anything plainly. But Elspeth had been 12 and already fluent in the language beneath her father's language, and she had understood every word. She had spent the next decade being agreeable. Carefully, strategically, and with the private fury of someone who smiled on the outside and kept everything real locked somewhere the smiling could not reach. She had learned to read rooms, to read men, to understand what they wanted before they knew they wanted it, and to position herself accordingly, not because she was servile, but because information was the only currency available to her, and she had gathered it with the quiet intensity of someone building an arsenal. The Duke of Ravenscroft had thought he was acquiring a compliant young woman from a family desperate enough to ask no difficult questions. He had not been entirely wrong about the desperation. He had been catastrophically wrong about the compliance. She had been inside his estate for 9 days before she found the correspondence. 11 before she understood what it meant. 4 months before the right opportunity came to act on it. She did not regret the waiting. Patience was not passivity. She had learned that distinction early, and it had saved her more than once. What she had not anticipated was Dashiell war. He had not spoken since they mounted, and the silence between them was the kind that had texture, filled with things being thought but not said. She could feel the quality of his attention even in the dark, the way he processed the road ahead, without appearing to look at it directly, the slight shift of his weight when they rounded a bend that told her he had ridden this route before, and knew where the uneven ground was. He was not a gentleman in the conventional sense, she had established that, but he was educated in the particular way of someone who had learned things through necessity and not instruction. which in her experience produced a far sharper mind than the drawing-rooms of England ever managed to cultivate. She found herself wanting to know his history, which was inconvenient, because wanting things from people who held advantage over her was precisely the kind of vulnerability she had spent years eliminating. "How long have you been watching the estate?" she said. It was not quite a question. She framed it as one anyway. "Long enough. That tells me nothing." "It tells you I was thorough," he said, "which should matter more to you than the specific number of days." She considered that he was not wrong, which annoyed her. "You said Ravenscroft's reach was wider than I knew," she said. "Explain that." He was quiet for a moment. The horse moved steadily beneath them. The fields dark on either side, no light anywhere except the moon. "The Duke is not acting alone," he said at last. "The estate, the money, the interest in certain kinds of women from certain kinds of families. It is part of something larger, a network of men with shared appetites and shared arrangements, and enough influence between them to make problems disappear without anyone asking inconvenient questions." The cold moved through her again. "How large?" she said. "Large enough that leaving the county is not sufficient. Large enough that what you took from his study is either the most valuable thing in England right now, or the most dangerous, and I have not yet determined which." She was very still against him. She could feel his voice where his chest met her back, and she was aware suddenly of how completely she was surrounded by him, how entirely dependent on his direction, and his horse, and his knowledge of this road she had never travelled. She was not accustomed to dependence. It sat on her like something borrowed and too large. "You knew I had taken something," she said. "I suspected. Now I know, because I didn't deny it." "Because of how you didn't deny it," he said. "There's a difference." She filed that away as well. He was perceptive in a way that went beyond intelligence into something more instinctive, and she would need to be considerably more careful with what she let her silences say. "What do you intend to do with me?" she asked. "Tonight, get you somewhere warm before your feet cause permanent damage." He paused. "After that, it depends on what you're willing to tell me. And if I'm not willing, then we'll have a longer journey than either of us wants." Ahead, a light appeared at the edge of the road, a farmhouse, small and dark-roofed, with a single window lit from within. He turned the horse toward it, and she felt the slight tightening of his arm as he guided them off the road, not aggressive, simply sure, and she thought about what it meant that he already had a destination, that he had prepared for this, that in the middle of what she had designed as her own careful plan, Dashiell War had been running a parallel one. She did not know yet whether their objectives aligned. She did not know who had sent him, or what he stood to gain, or how much he actually understood about what the document contained. She did not know if he was a man she could trust, or simply a man who had decided for his own reasons that her survival was temporarily useful to him. What she knew was that he had pulled her out of the dark, and she was alive, and her feet were numb, and somewhere behind them, the Duke of Ravenscroft was realizing that she was gone, and the men her father owed money to were still waiting, and the document against her ribs contained the names of people powerful enough to ruin her completely if they ever discovered she had read it. The farmhouse door opened before they reached it. A woman stood in the frame, older, with a lamp held high and an expression that suggested she had been expecting them. She looked at Elspeth with sharp, assessing eyes, and then at Dashiell with the familiarity of someone who had known him long enough to stop being surprised by the things he brought to her door. Who was this woman? How many people were already part of whatever Dashiell War was arranging around her? And how long before Elspeth had to decide whether to trust him or to run from him too? The woman's name was Orinthia. She did not offer a surname, and Dashiell did not supply one, which told Elspeth that surnames were not the currency exchanged in this particular arrangement. Orinthia was perhaps 60, broad-shouldered, with grey hair pinned close to her head. and the hands of someone who had worked hard for most of her life, and had stopped apologizing for it. She looked at Elspeth's feet when she came through the door, and made a sound that was not quite sympathy, and not quite reproach, but landed somewhere. Between the two, she pointed at a chair near the fire without speaking. Elspeth sat. The farmhouse was small and clean, with low ceilings and the smell of wood smoke, and something herbed that had been cooked earlier and not entirely cleared away. There was nothing decorative about it. Every object in the room existed because it was needed, and that practicality felt, in the current moment, like the most reassuring thing Elspeth had encountered in months. Orinthia crouched before her without ceremony and examined her feet with the brisk efficiency of someone who had done this before, treated the cuts that needed treating, and wrapped both feet in clean cloth without asking permission or offering commentary. Elspeth watched her and said nothing. She was not accustomed to being tended to. It produced a feeling she could not immediately name, something that sat close to the surface and required effort to keep there. Dashiell stood at the window with his back to the room. He had not removed his coat. He was watching the road, she understood, tracking whether they had been followed, and the alertness in his posture was not the performed vigilance of a man who wanted to appear capable. It was the genuine article, my 5 habitual and automatic, the posture of someone for whom watchfulness had long since stopped being a choice and become simply the way he stood in the world. She found herself studying him with the same careful attention she had trained on the Duke's corridors and schedules, the same methodical inventory, and she caught herself doing it and looked back at the fire. That was a different kind of attention. She needed to be precise about the distinction. When Orinthia finished and moved to the far end of the room, Dashiell turned from the window. "The document," he said, not unkindly, but without preamble. Elspeth met his eyes. "Tell me who sent you first." He pulled a chair from the table and sat across from her, close enough that the firelight reached both of them. He was quiet for a moment, and she had the sense that he was making a decision about how much honesty was tactically appropriate. 5, which was a calculation she recognized because she made it constantly herself. "A man named Aldrich Fenn," he said. "He was in Ravenscroft's network 18 months ago. He got out, not cleanly." He paused. "He lost a great deal in the process. He has been gathering evidence since then, building a case that can be taken to people with enough authority to act on it. When he learned that someone inside the estate had accessed Ravenscroft's private study, he sent me to find out who and whether what they'd found was usable." Elspeth was quiet. The fire moved. Outside, nothing. "You were expecting a frightened woman who stumbled onto something she didn't understand," she said. Something shifted in his expression. "I was not expecting you," he said, and the plainness of it landed differently than she anticipated. Without flattery, without manoeuvre, simply as a fact, he was still in the process of adjusting to. She reached into the lining of her cloak. The document was folded into 4, the paper dense, with names and figures and dates, written in the cramped, careful hand of someone who had never expected anyone else to read it. She had read it 11 days ago and had since committed every line to memory, because memory could not be confiscated. She held it out. He took it. He read it in the firelight with the focused stillness of a man, reading something he had been working toward for a long time, and she watched his face as he moved through it. He gave very little away, but she caught the moment his jaw tightened, brief and controlled, and knew which passage he had reached. "You understand what this is," he said. "Not a question." "It is a record of transactions," she said. "Payments made and received across 14 months, with names attached to each one. 3 of those names belong to men who sit in Parliament. 1 belongs to a magistrate, and 1, she paused, belongs to my father." The silence that followed had weight. She had carried that particular fact alone for 11 days, had turned it over in the dark hours of the estate, pressing at it the way a tongue returns to a sore place, unable to leave it alone, and unable to make it stop hurting. Her father, not as a victim of the network, not as someone entrapped or coerced, but as a willing participant. His name beside a figure that represented exactly the kind of debt he had always claimed to be trying to escape. He had not been trying to escape it. He had been deepening it in a different direction. Dashiell was watching her with an expression that had moved past assessment into something quieter, more careful. "How long have you known?" he asked. 11 days. "And you stayed?" "Leaving early would have wasted it," she said. "I needed it to mean something. If I ran the moment I found it, it was just a frightened woman with a stolen page. If I waited, prepared properly, and left, with the full document at the right moment, it became something that could actually be used." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved across the fields and pressed briefly at the farmhouse walls. "Aldrich Fenn needs to see this," he said. "He is in Bristol. 3 days' ride." "I am aware of the geography of England, Mr. Waugh. I am aware that you are," he said, and again that almost smile, contained and quickly gone. "I am asking if you will come." She looked at the fire. 3 days. 3 days on a road, with a man she had known for a matter of hours, moving toward a stranger in Bristol who may or may not be what Dashiell had described, carrying a document that named her own father as a participant in something criminal. Ravenscroft behind her, the network ahead of her, and beside her, this man who had appeared in the dark as though he had been placed there by someone who understood exactly what she would need, which was either extraordinary fortune or something far more orchestrated. She still did not know which. She turned back to him. "Your instinct is to trust Aldrich Fenn," she said. "I want to know why, not the history, the instinct. What makes you certain he is not simply another layer of the same problem?" He held her gaze, and for the first time, she saw something pass through his expression that was not controlled, not measured, not tactically selected. Something that looked, briefly and undeniably, like old pain. "Because I was in that network once as well," he said, "and Aldrich Fenn is the reason I got out." The fire crackled. Orinthia moved quietly at the far end of the room. The road outside remained dark and empty. Elspeth looked at the man across from her and understood that the ground had shifted again, that he had handed her something real, something that cost him, and she did not yet know whether that was honesty or the most sophisticated version of manipulation she had ever encountered. What had Dashiell Waugh done inside that network? What had it taken from him to leave? They left before dawn. Orinthia pressed food into a cloth bundle without being asked, and handed it to Dashiell at the door with the brevity of someone who had learned that prolonged goodbyes were a form of sentimentality she could not afford. She looked at Elspeth once more before they left, directly and without softness, the look of a woman measuring something, and then she nodded, a single small motion that felt like it meant more than Elspeth had context to interpret. She thought about that nod for the first mile. Dashiell had sourced a second horse from somewhere behind the farmhouse, a grey mare with a calm eye and a steady gait, and Elspeth rode her without complaint. Her wrapped feet found the stirrups carefully. The pain was manageable. She had managed worse. The road north was empty at that hour, the fields on either side still locked in the flat grey of pre-dawn, and they rode without speaking for a long time. She was grateful for that. She needed the silence to think, and thinking required distance from him, which was difficult to achieve when he was 12 feet away, and she was acutely conscious of every movement he made. That consciousness irritated her. She examined it the way she examined most things that irritated her, directly and without flinching, until she understood its shape. It was not simply that he was capable, though he was. It was not simply that he had told her something true the night before, something that had cost him. It was that he moved through a dangerous world with a particular quality of steadiness that she recognized because she had spent years trying to cultivate it in herself, and seeing it in someone else produced a feeling she had no accurate word for. Something between recognition and longing, and the very specific grief of a person who has been alone in something for so long that encountering company in it feels almost unbearable. She looked at the road ahead and kept her face arranged. By mid-morning they had covered significant ground and the landscape had changed, the flat fields giving way to rolling land with more tree cover, which Dashel seemed to prefer. He moved them off the main road twice, without explanation, and she did not ask for one, because she had already understood that when he altered course, it was because he had seen or heard something she had not yet registered, and questioning it in the moment served no one. The second time he moved them into the trees, she heard it herself a few seconds later, horses on the road behind them, more than two, moving fast. They sat still in the tree cover, and she watched his face while the sound grew and then passed. 4 riders in dark coats, moving with the focused urgency of men on a specific errand. Not travellers, not post-riders. Men looking for something, or someone. When the sound had fully faded, he turned to look at her. She was already looking at him. Ravenscroft, she said. Or someone coordinating with him. He watched the road for another moment. They're moving fast. They'll reach the last farmhouse by early afternoon. Orinthia. The thought arrived with a cold weight. She'll be in danger, Elspeth said. Orinthia has been in danger before, he said. She knows what to say and what to show them. There is nothing at that house that connects to us. Except that we were there. She has housed travellers before. She will house them again. There is no thread to pull. He said it with the confidence of someone who had designed the arrangement to withstand exactly this kind of pressure. And she believed him. And she also noticed that he had not said Orinthia would be fine. He had said she knew how to handle it, which was a meaningful distinction. They moved again, staying in the tree line where the ground allowed, and the morning stretched into afternoon, with the particular tension of people covering distance under pressure, not speaking of the pressure, speaking instead of small practical things when they spoke at all, the best route, the condition of the roads. Whether the grey mare would need water before the next town. It was late afternoon when he said, without preamble, "What will you do with your father?" She had been waiting for that question. She had asked it to herself every night for 11 days, and had not arrived at an answer that satisfied her. "I don't know," she said, which was the truest thing she had said in recent memory. "The document names him. If Aldrich Fenn takes this to the right authorities, your father's involvement will be part of the case. I am aware." "I am not asking if you are aware," he said, with a patience that somehow made it more direct rather than less. "I am asking what you want to happen to him." She was quiet for a long moment. The trees moved around them, light breaking through in long, pale shafts, and she thought about her father's face, the particular expression he wore when he was about to explain to her why something difficult was, in fact, for her benefit. She thought about the 12-year-old girl in the Sydney parlour. She thought about 4 months in Ravenscroft's estate, which her father had arranged, which he had presented as opportunity, which she now understood had been a transaction. "He made a choice," she said at last. "He has made many choices. I have spent most of my life absorbing the consequences of them." She paused. "I will not protect him from this one." Dashel said nothing, but she felt the quality of his silence change, something settling in it, like a held breath released. They reached the outskirts of a market town as the light was failing and stopped at an inn that was large enough to be anonymous and small enough not to attract the kind of clientele who asked questions. Dashel handled the arrangements. She waited with the horses and thought about Bristol, about Aldrich Fenn, about the document folded into her cloak, which she had not returned to him after the farmhouse and which he had not asked for, which was either trust or strategy, and she still could not determine which. The inn was warm and smelled of tallow and roasting meat, and the accumulated presence of many people passing through, and after 4 months in the controlled, perfumed atmosphere of Ravenscroft's estate, it felt intensely real. She sat at a table in the corner, while Dashiell spoke to the innkeeper, and she watched the room with the habitual attention she could not turn off, cataloguing faces, noting exits, calculating. He came back and sat across from her. Food arrived shortly after, simple and hot, and they ate in the comfortable silence that had begun to develop between them over the course of the day, the silence of two people who had stopped performing for each other without quite deciding to. Halfway through the meal he said, "I was 23 when I was recruited into the network." She looked up. He was looking at his plate. "I was in debt. Not my own debts, my brother's, but the distinction stops mattering quickly when the creditors have found you. A man approached me with an offer. The work seemed straightforward at first, carrying information between parties, ensuring certain meetings occurred and others did not. I told myself it was temporary." He paused. "It is always temporary, at first." She said nothing. She understood that he was not looking for response. He was doing what she had done on horseback that morning, examining something directly, giving it its proper name. "It took me 2 years to understand the full shape of what I was part of. Another year to find a way out that did not end with me in the ground. Aldrich Fenn built that exit. He did not have to. He had his own considerable problems at that point." He looked up then. "That is why I trust him. Not because he is without fault, because he built a door for someone he had no obligation to." The fire at the far end of the room moved and settled. Someone across the inn laughed at something, the ordinary sound of ordinary evening. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because tomorrow we reach Bristol," he said. "And when we do, you will have to decide how much to tell Aldrich, how much to hold back, and how far you are willing to go with this. And I thought you should know who is sitting across from you when you make that decision." She looked at him for a long moment. The firelight was doing something to the angles of his face that she noted and set aside with the same firm deliberateness she had been applying to such observations all day. "You want me to trust you," she said. "I want you to have accurate information," he said. "What you do with it is yours." Outside the inn, in the dark of the yard, one of the horses shifted and stamped once, the sound carrying clearly through the evening quiet. It was nothing. It was probably nothing. But Dashiell's eyes moved to the window immediately and stayed there for 3 full seconds before returning to her. And in those 3 seconds she saw the thing beneath the steadiness. The thing that the steadiness had been built on top of, the particular vigilance of a man who had learned through genuine damage that safety was not a state but a practice, maintained constantly, never assumed. She recognized it. She had built the same thing in herself, with different materials, over different years. She said, quietly, "What are you not telling me about Bristol?" He was still for a moment. Then he said, "Aldrich Fenn sent word 3 days ago. The meeting point has changed. There is someone else who wants to be present when the document is examined." "Who?" "Someone who claims to have corroborating evidence. Someone whose involvement would make the case considerably stronger." He met her eyes. "Someone who also claims to know you." The name he said next was one she had not heard in 4 years, one she had believed she would never hear again, connected to a chapter of her life she had closed and locked and chosen not to revisit. The room was warm, the fire was burning, everything was exactly as it had been a moment ago. Nothing was the same at all. The name he said was Merritt Cavanmore, her brother. She had not seen him in 4 years, had not heard from him in 3, and the last time they had been in the same room he had been 20 years old, and already moving through the world with the particular recklessness of a young man who had inherited their father's charm and none of his caution. She had loved him with the fierce, exhausted love of someone who has spent years trying to prevent a person from destroying themselves, and has finally understood that the preventing is not within their power. she had let him go. She had closed that door because keeping it open was costing her things she could not afford to keep losing. And now he was in Bristol. She set down her fork. The food was still warm on the plate, and she could not look at it. "How long have you known?" she said. "Since yesterday morning," Dashel said. "Aldrich's message reached me at the last waypoint before Orinthia's farmhouse. I did not tell you last night because you had enough to carry, and telling you on the road today seemed worse." She considered that. The logic was not unsound. She was also aware that she was sitting very still in the particular way she sat when something had struck somewhere deep, and she was preventing the strike from showing. "Is he in danger?" she said. "Aldrich believes he came to Bristol of his own volition, that he has been building his own evidence separately, without knowledge of Aldrich's network or mine, that the convergence is genuine." "And what do you believe?" Dashel was quiet for a moment. "I believe it is possible. I also believe that a young man who has been gathering evidence against a network his own father participates in is either very brave or very exposed, and I am not yet certain which." She stood up from the table. Not in agitation, she did not do agitation, but because sitting had become impossible and she needed to stand. She moved to the edge of the room, to the small window that looked out onto the dark inn yard, and she pressed her fingers against the cold glass and looked at nothing. Merritt, 4 years older than the last time she saw him. Still, in her mind, 20 years old, and moving too fast towards something she could not stop. She heard Dashel rise. He came to stand behind her, not close, leaving distance between them, but present in the way he had been present since the trees outside Ravenscroft's estate. That quality of steadiness that did not demand anything from her, but did not withdraw either. "You closed contact with him," he said. It was not a question. He had clearly been thorough. "He was going to get himself killed following me into situations I was handling," she said. "Cutting contact was the safest thing I could do for him. And for yourself." She was quiet. "Yes," she said, "and for myself." Dashel said nothing more. She was grateful for that, because there was nothing more that needed saying on the subject, and she had already said more than she typically permitted herself. They left at first light. Bristol arrived in the grey mid-morning, the city rising from the riverbanks, with the particular density of a place that had been growing fast and without excessive planning, buildings pressing close. The smell of the water and commerce and coal smoke layered together in the damp air. Dashel moved them through it with the confidence of someone who knew it well, away from the broader thoroughfares, through narrower streets where the buildings leaned toward each other overhead. The address was a printer's shop, closed at this hour, with a door at the side that opened when Dashel knocked in a particular pattern. A young man with ink-stained hands led them through a back corridor and up a narrow staircase to a room that contained 3 people. The first was Aldrich Fenn. He was older than she had expected, perhaps 55, with a lean, weathered face and the eyes of someone who had spent a long time being careful. He looked at Dashel with the warmth of genuine history, and at Elspeth with the careful respect of someone who had been told enough to know she had earned it. The second was a woman she did not know, sharp-faced and watchful, who was introduced only as a contact with connections to the magistrate's office in London, and who said nothing beyond a brief acknowledgement of her presence. The third was Merritt. He was thinner than she remembered, older in the face in ways that had nothing to do with the 4 years and everything to do with what he had clearly been doing inside them. He looked at her from across the room, with an expression she could not immediately read, too many things moving through it at once. And then he crossed the room, and she found that she had moved toward him as well, and they met in the middle, and she put her arms around her brother, and he held on with a tightness that told her everything about what the last 4 years had. cost him that she had not been present to witness. She stepped back first. She needed to see his face. "You should have stayed out of this," she said. "You should have told me what you were doing," he said. "I was protecting you." "I know," he said. "You always were. I went looking anyway." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned to the room. What followed was 3 hours of the most consequential conversation of her life. Aldrich laid out the architecture of what they had assembled, Merritt's evidence placed alongside hers, corroborating and extending it. 2 parallel lines of investigation that had been running without knowledge of each other, and that together formed something far more complete than either alone. The woman with connections to London examined the document, asked precise questions, and made notes in a small book that she kept angled away from everyone else in the room. The network was larger than Elspeth had understood. The document she had taken named 14 people directly. Merritt's evidence connected those 14 to a further 9. Between them, they had enough to move, and the woman from London said so in plain, contained language that carried the weight of someone who had the authority to act on what she was saying. It was in the second hour that the door at the base of the staircase opened. Dashel was at the window before anyone else had fully registered the sound. His hand was at his coat. Aldrich was on his feet. The ink-stained young man appeared in the doorway looking pale and said, very quietly, that there were men outside, 2 of them, asking questions at the printer's front entrance. Ravenscroft's reach. She had known it was wide. She had not known it was this fast. Dashel looked at Aldrich. Something passed between them in the wordless shorthand of people who had navigated emergencies together before. Aldrich turned to the woman from London and said 3 words that Elspeth did not catch, and the woman stood and moved to the far wall and pressed something that opened a section of the panelling that had not, until that moment, appeared to be a door. Dashel turned to Elspeth. "Go," he said. "You're not coming. Someone needs to manage what's at the front of the building," he said. "It is not going to be you or Merritt." She looked at him. The room was moving around them, Merritt taking her arm gently, Aldrich moving toward the staircase, the woman already through the panel door with her small notebook held against her chest. Everything was in motion. She had perhaps 15 seconds. "Dashel," she said. "Go," he said again, quieter this time. She did not go. She crossed the remaining distance between them, and took his face in her hands and looked at him directly, which she had been careful not to do at full proximity until this moment, and she said, "You do not get to disappear. That is not the arrangement." Something moved through his expression that she felt in her chest. "What is the arrangement?" he said. "You tell me when we are on the other side of this." She let him go. She turned and went through the panel door with her brother's hand at her back, and the sound of voices from the floor below growing louder, and she moved through the dark passage beyond the wall without looking back, because looking back was not something she could afford, and also because she knew, with the particular certainty of someone who has learned to trust their own reading of people, that Dashel War was not a man who would disappear. The passage opened into a yard, then a lane, then a broader street, and the woman from London moved them through Bristol with practised efficiency, and the city closed around them, and behind them the printer's shop either held or it did not. Elspeth walked with her brother beside her, and the cold air in her lungs, and the document gone now, left in the hands of someone with the authority to use it, and she felt the specific lightness of a person who has been carrying something for a very long time and has finally, deliberately, set it down. Her father's name was in that document. What happened next was not within her control. She had done the thing she came to do. Merritt walked quietly beside her. After a moment he said, "Are you all right?" She thought about the question, with the seriousness it deserved. "Ask me again when we know he's out," she said. Her brother looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has just understood something about his sister that he had not fully understood before. He said nothing. He reached over and took her hand briefly, and then let it go. They kept walking. They were taken to a house near the water. The woman from London, whose name turned out to be Cressida Vane, owned it or had access to it in the way she seemed to have access to most things, quietly and without excessive explanation. It was narrow and tall, pressed between two larger buildings on a street that ran parallel to the river, and it smelled of damp stone and old wood and the particular stillness of a place that had been waiting to be useful. Cressida settled them in a room on the first floor, left food and a fire, and told them she would have word within 2 hours. Then she left with the brisk self-sufficiency of a woman who had never once in her life waited for someone else to handle a situation she could handle herself. Elspeth sat near the fire. Merritt sat across from her. For a while, neither of them spoke, which was its own kind of conversation. They had always been able to do that, to sit in the same silence and mean different things by it, and understand each other anyway. It was perhaps the thing she had missed most in the years of keeping him at a distance. Not the talking, the not needing to. "How long were you gathering it?" she asked eventually. 2 years, he said. "Closer to 2.5. I started after Father came to me with an arrangement he wanted me to facilitate. A meeting between 2 men I did not know, carrying materials I was not supposed to examine." He paused. "I examined them." She looked at him. He had their father's jaw and their mother's eyes, and the combination had always produced a face that people underestimated, which she had watched him use to considerable effect even as a child. "You never told me," she said. "You had already closed contact, and I thought—" He stopped, chose again. "I thought if I came to you with something half-built, you would take it from me and finish it yourself. I wanted to finish it myself." She sat with that for a moment. The fire moved. Outside, the river made its slow, indifferent progress toward the sea. "I would have," she said. "I know," he said. "That is why I didn't come." There was no accusation in it. That was the thing that made it land with the weight it did. He was not reproaching her. He was simply naming what had been true between them, the dynamic that had calcified over years without either of them quite choosing it. Her managing and him being managed. Both of them having learned the pattern from watching their father and having repeated it without noticing until it had become the whole shape of their relationship. She had left him to protect him. She had also left him because managing him had been exhausting and she had not had enough left over. She had not fully admitted that second part, even to herself, until this moment. "I'm sorry," she said. He looked at her with some surprise. She did not apologize frequently. She was aware of that. "I closed the door because I was tired," she said. "Not only because I was afraid for you. Both things were true, and I only told myself the one that was easier to live with." Merritt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I knew you were tired. I was not always easy to carry." "No," she said. "But you were worth carrying. I should have found a better way." He nodded, slowly, the nod of someone receiving something they had needed for a long time and were being careful not to drop. Then he leaned forward and put his elbows on his knees and looked at the fire. "What happens to Father?" he said. "The same thing that happens to the others," she said. Cressida's contact in London moves forward with the case. The document is in the right hands now. Neither of us can pull it back, and I would not if I could. Merritt nodded again. He did not look relieved exactly. He looked like a person who had made peace with a hard thing long before the hard thing arrived, and was now simply watching it come. "He made his choices," he said. "He did," she said. "We are not responsible for them." They sat with that together, which was the most useful thing they could do with it. The 2 hours Cressida had promised became 3. The fire burned lower, and Merritt fed it without being asked, and they talked, carefully at first, and then less carefully. filling in 4 years in the way that people do when they have stopped pretending the gap was smaller than it was. He told her things she had not known. She told him things she had not told anyone. The room grew warmer. Outside, Bristol went on being Bristol, indifferent and continuous. It was past the 3rd hour when she heard the door below. She was on her feet before she had decided to stand. Steps on the staircase, more than one person, and then the door opened, and Cressida came through it first, and behind her was Dashel War, coat torn at the shoulder, a cut above the same eyebrow that already carried the old scar, moving with the slight, careful gait of someone managing pain without advertising it. She crossed the room. She stopped in front of him and looked at the cut, then at his eyes, assessing. And he let her do it with the patient stillness of someone accustomed to being examined, and not accustomed to minding it, which told her something. "The men at the door?" she said. "Handled," he said. "Cressida's contact in London has already been notified. There will be movement on the warrants within the week. Ravenscroft will be aware that something has shifted by morning." He paused. He will not be able to stop it. The document is already beyond his reach. She breathed out. It was a small breath, contained, but he noticed it. "And you?" she said, quietly enough that it was only for him. "Intact," he said. The corner of his mouth moved, mostly. She reached up and pressed her fingers briefly against the uninjured side of his face. Not the cut, not the scar, the plain, undamaged skin at the edge of his jaw. A touch that lasted only a moment and said more than she had vocabulary for. His hand came up and covered hers before she withdrew it, and they stood like that for 3 seconds that felt like the calmest 3 seconds she had experienced in years. Then she lowered her hand and he let her, and they turned back to the room. Cressida was already explaining next steps to Merritt in her concise, undecorated way, the immediate movements required, the safe arrangements in place, the timeline for the legal proceedings now in motion. The picture she painted was not simple. The network was large, and its unravelling would take time and would not be without friction. There would be a period of exposure and uncertainty, names surfacing in places that would produce difficult conversations, consequences moving outward in ways that could not be entirely predicted or controlled. But the document was real. The evidence was corroborated. The people now holding it had both the authority and the will to act. What had begun 4 months ago in the private study of the Duke of Ravenscroft's estate, with a woman reading something she was never meant to read, had become something that could not be quietly buried. That night, after Cressida had gone, and Merritt had fallen asleep in the chair by the rebuilt fire with the ease of someone running on depleted reserves, Elspeth stood at the window that looked out over the river. The water was dark and moving, and caught the city's lights in long, broken lines. Dashel came to stand beside her. They were quiet together for a while, the comfortable kind, the kind that had been building since a dark road outside Ravenscroft's estate, and was now simply what existed between them, natural and unannounced. "What do you want?" he said. "Not next week? Not the proceedings? After?" She looked at the river. She had not let herself think about after in a very long time. After had been a concept she kept at a distance because focusing on it required believing she would reach it, and belief of that kind had felt, for years, like a liability she could not afford. She let herself think about it now. "Somewhere that is mine," she said. "Not arranged by my father, or assigned by a husband, or contingent on anyone else's requirements. Somewhere I chose. That is achievable," he said. "I know," she said. "I intend to achieve it." He turned to look at her profile. She could feel it. "I told you last night that I would tell you the arrangement when we were on the other side," he said. She turned to look at him. "The arrangement," he said, "is that I would very much like to know where you choose, and to be in reasonable proximity to it." He said it with the same plainness he brought to everything, No ornamentation, no performance. Just the fact of it offered directly. She looked at him for a long moment. The river moved behind the glass. Merritt breathed slowly in the chair by the fire. The city carried on. "That," she said, "is acceptable." He nodded. She turned back to the window. He remained beside her, and the warmth of him at her shoulder was the warmth of something chosen rather than endured, and the difference between those two things was, she had learned, the whole of it. She had gone into the dark of Ravenscroft's estate to find something that could undo a powerful man's careful arrangements. She had found that. She had also found her brother, and a woman named Cressida, who moved through the world with purposeful authority, and a man who had stood in the same darkness she had stood in and built something steady inside it. She had not planned for any of that. She was, for the first time in longer than she could accurately measure, glad to have been surprised. This story is complete, but the channel is not. If Elspeth and Dashiell's journey moved you, subscribe now, because the next story is already waiting, and it will pull you under just as fast. Stay close. You do not want to miss what comes next.